Thanks, Madam Speaker. It's always an honour to rise in the House of Commons and represent the people of Niagara West. I appreciate their support for the past 19 years, and I want to make sure that they know I never take it for granted. They sent me here to be their voice of Parliament, to speak to issues important to them in our beautiful riding of Niagara West. I proudly rise to introduce a private member's bill that is not only important to my constituents, but also to over 6 million Canadians. The bill reads, "This enactment amends the Financial Administration Act to provide that the Treasury Board may not require as a condition of employment in the federal public administration that a person receive a vaccine against COVID-19. It also amends the Labour Code to provide that regulations may not be made that require as a term or a condition of employment in or in connection with the operation of a federal work, undertaking, or business that the person receive a vaccine against COVID-19. In addition, the enactment amends the Aeronautical Act, the Railway Safety Act, and the Canadian Shipping Act to provide that no regulation, order, or other instrument made under any of those acts to prevent the introduction or spread of COVID-19 may prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting a person from boarding an aircraft, a train, or a vessel solely on the ground that they have not received a vaccine against that disease." The short name of the bill is an act to prevent the imposition by the federal government of vaccine mandates for employment and travel, or simply Prevention of Government-Imposed Vaccination Mandates Act. Like I said earlier, this bill is incredibly important to my constituents and more than 6 million Canadians across the country, more than actually voted for this government in 2021. This bill is about freedom. It's about reining in the ballooning and intrusive government that got used to interfering in Canadians' lives with extreme outreach. The bill was initially introduced by our Conservative leader, the member for Carleton, because there was quite a bit of overlap between his bill and my previous bill. We agreed I would go forward with his. I'm grateful that his views are aligned with mine on this issue of freedom. After all, freedom is at the core of our Conservative way of thinking and is essential to governing and to government. This bill, if passed, will prohibit the federal government from discriminating against federal public servants, federally regulated workers, and federally regulated travel based on health status. Specifically, it will prohibit the federal government from mandating COVID vaccines for employment and travel. For far too many Canadians, the last 3 years have been some of the most difficult times in their lives. During the pandemic, many Canadians made the personal choice of remaining unvaccinated, specifically and only with respect to COVID. Their personal choice about their health put them in opposition to the views of the Prime Minister. As a consequence of this, they suffered deeply. They were shut out of their churches, they were banned from traveling, banned from seeing their loved ones, and fired from their jobs. Some Canadians were stripped of their employment insurance benefits. Madam Speaker, I know that to many this seems like it was long ago, so let me refresh people's memories of these egregious government actions. It was May of 2021. While the country was going through COVID pandemic, the Prime Minister said in an interview, "We're not a country that makes vaccinations mandatory." The Prime Minister clearly stated that he didn't support vaccine mandates in May of 2021. That all changed after he saw the political opportunity and after he saw the polls. He saw an opportunity to win a majority government by wedging voters on their personal health choices. He saw that he may gain votes if he divides Canadians and pits them against each other. He did this by putting in place mandates that restricted the freedoms of Canadians. And when Canadians disagreed with this Prime Minister's policy, he appeared on television calling them misogynist and racist. He also said that they held unacceptable views. Next, the Liberals introduced the country's first mandates, a divisive, vindictive, stigmatizing, and cruel measure. In an instant, millions of Canadians were, because of their personal medical choices, put on unpaid leave and banned from taking federal transportation. This was in addition to being ostracized by friends and strangers alike, sometimes even their family, as a consequence of the Prime Minister's divisive rhetoric. Let's just say it's how it is. The government saw this as an opportunity for political gain, and they took it. Even when the world began to open up, the government kept these measures in place, continuing to restrict personal freedoms of millions of Canadians. Soon after mandates were introduced, an election was called. The Prime Minister ran a campaign largely advocating for the violation of some of the most fundamental civil liberties that Canadians have. Not long after, Mandates were extended to members of the Canadian Armed Forces. CAP members who chose to remain unvaccinated were rendered unsuitable for further service and booted out. This decision caused turmoil among senior CAP members who questioned the legality. In a decision of May 30th of this year, the Military Grievances External Review found that this vaccine mandate had breached the charter rights of military personnel. I'm sure in the coming months we'll see more of this decision when it condemns the government's divisive and unscientific vaccine mandate. This Liberal government looked for soldiers in the eyes and said that they were unsuitable because of their personal health choices. It almost sounds like a dystopian movie plot where the Liberals played the villains, pushing citizens who speak out of line or think for themselves. Quite frankly, Madam Speaker, that's a movie I wouldn't want to see become a reality. But unfortunately, in many ways, it has become so. Quite frankly, this was just another display of the Prime Minister wanting more control over Canadians. Big government overreach divided Canadians, turning neighbours and families against one another. To the Liberals, it's always about winning. Not about Canadians, and certainly not compassionate in difficult times. For those who made different personal medical choices, the government made them outcasts in their own communities, firing them from jobs, banning them from travelling, and ostracizing them from their friends. Canadians should have the freedom to make personal health decisions for themselves without social and economic threats from the government. They have the freedom to do so, a freedom that should never, ever be cast aside again. But if you didn't agree with this Prime Minister, which agreed was right, you were punished. The scale of this was unprecedented in Canadian history. Millions of Canadians voiced their worries and concerns, including hundreds to my office. They emailed, called, and wrote to me, as well as many of the MPs here in this chamber. One of the stories I listened to was from a young man named Daniel. Daniel chose to remain unvaccinated because of his own personal fears of a fairly new vaccine, especially since he had had a bad reaction to one before. And because of his personal health decision, he was scoffed at and he was treated differently. He watched in horror as different levels of government treated Canadians who were unvaccinated like they were some sort of criminals, all because of the example and pressure exerted by this Prime Minister and his Liberal government to fall in line. Unscientific mandates kept him from seeing his friends, his family, and most especially his grandparents. He couldn't go and watch a hockey game with his grandfather or go to a restaurant to celebrate his sister's birthday. Most of all, he couldn't see his grandmother while she sat alone in a nursing home, unable to spend the holidays with her family. Daniel spoke up and sent me a letter because he was inspired by what our current leader and many other caucus members had said. He says he will be forever thankful that on this side of the House we speak up for what we truly believe in. What happened to Daniel was not a one-time thing. I personally know of a friend incredibly close to me who also suffered. As a father, he watched his child was banned from playing basketball, a sport they both love. His son was told he wasn't accepted, not as a player on the court, but as a person, all because of one personal choice. Outside of sports, his son was kept from playing with his friends and even denied entry to stores where he was forced to wait outside in minus 40-degree weather. These Canadians weren't hateful. They weren't conspiracy theorists or science deniers, like the Liberals were so disgustingly saying at the time. Might I add, labels some Liberals still repeat. These were good folks who just wanted to live their lives without government forcefully telling them what to do. All they asked was to be left alone. And because of that simple request, they experienced hardship like they never had before. Hardship that was facilitated by legislation and rhetoric that was sparked by this Liberal government. For these Canadians, the Liberals didn't just take their jobs, they took their livelihoods, their reputations. You can see this with the government invocation of the Emergencies Act, where Liberals accused protesters of being arsonists and thieves. In reality, Ottawa police had unequivocally said there was no connection between the fires and the protesters. Despite this, the Minister of Public Safety, the leader of the NDP, and the Liberal members, like the member of Pickering-Uxbridge, shamefully used these false stories to justify their Emergencies Act. This misinformation and disinformation was not just peddled by government officials. The media, mostly the CBC, good pals of the Liberals, tried to claim that Canadian-led fundraisers supporting the protests were being funded by foreign agents in Russia and the US. Later, they had to walk this back, those remarks, because the overwhelming majority of donations, close to 90%, came from Canadians who were upset about how their fellow Canadians were being treated. The legacy media, the Liberals and the NDP didn't care about the facts. They all relied were unconfirmed online chatter. They were desperate to cling on to something. In August of 2021, the now infamous front page of the Toronto Star had an opinion piece with the line, "I have no empathy left for the willfully unvaccinated. Let them die." This was one of the lowest points in our country to see something like that happen to folks, many and some who live in my riding. In January of 2022, a Quebec judge ruled that a father couldn't see his son after the father posted on social media that was critical of vaccine mandates. The judge labeled him a conspiracy theorist that was too dangerous to see his own son. There's even more. Not even students were safe from being targeted. Across Canada, universities and colleges banned students from going to classes or participating in campus events. Students' chance of graduation and access to quality education were put in jeopardy because of these mandates. Canadians were being signaled out for their personal medical choices and punished because of their hateful rhetoric of the Liberal government. While protesters were outside, protesting for their freedoms in the freezing cold of Ottawa, the Liberals sat in their cushy warm offices freezing Canadians' bank accounts. The Liberals kept them from buying food, paying rent, paying utility bills and other essentials. They wanted to paint the protesters as evil, so they were falsely told Canadians that the protesters were ransacking offices. Another complete fabrication to justify their complete and total overreach. While the Liberals covered their ears and called people's names, I was listening to people. I knew that compassion, understanding, and empathy was the way out of this Liberal-created crisis. I listened to the stories of Canadians in my communities and across the country. These stories also inspired members of the Prime Minister's own Liberal Party to speak up. In February of 2022, the member from Louis-Hubert said that he was uncomfortable with how his government was handling the pandemic. He pointed out how the government had changed, had taken a more stigmatizing and divisive approach to their pandemic policy. He reminded the Prime Minister to not demonize people who just disagreed with his policies. The member for Marc-Fortin also agreed, saying that there were more in the Liberal caucus who felt the same way. With all of this, the Liberals set an egregious example to the provinces and municipalities. Premiers and municipal politicians across the country felt forced to get in line and follow Ottawa's lead. If they didn't, the legacy media, so closely aligned with the Liberals on almost everything, would have made them pay a heavy political price. Clearly, this was about control. Thankfully, members of our Conservative Party stood up and spoke their minds, including our leader. He stood up for the freedom of personal choice. We want Canada to be the freest country on earth. We must ensure that Canadians will never lose their medical freedom. I will never let people forget how the Liberals government trampled on the rights of Canadians for 3 long years, how this Prime Minister treated them during that time, how he froze Canadians' bank accounts, got them fired, stripped them of the unemployment insurance benefits, and banned them from travelling. The Liberals did all these things to achieve one goal: political success. The Liberals capitalized on fear and made opponents their scapegoats. These millions of Canadians deserve a voice, and they deserve accountability from the government. Only Conservatives will give these Canadians a voice and stop excessive government overreach so that they can take back control of their lives. Only the Conservatives will bring home freedom. The COVID-19 policies put in place by this Liberal government were simply too much. It wasn't right. We all know that, or at least I hope we do. We can't go back to firing people for your personal medical choice, something so intimate to Canadians. What the Canadians choose for their health is their freedom, and theirs only. We can't go back to stripping people of their employment insurance benefits because of a personal medical choice. We can't go back to prohibiting people from traveling or working because they made a decision for themselves. It was cruel. There was no compassion for our fellow Canadians who may have thought a bit differently than the government. It violated the rights of Canadians for way too long and without any scientific basis. I hope all members in this House will show compassion, empathy, and understanding by supporting this bill and making sure that our fellow Canadians are never treated with such disdain by their government ever again. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.